drawing that line, deciding where that line is getting harder and harder, isn't it, in our politics, both at home and abroad?
It is getting harder, Sheila. I think that, look, this is one of the things that I've always been frustrated about this debate on free speech, which is that I don't think there is a debate in British politics which is quite so leaden, and this is up against some stiff competition, is quite so leaden with so much hypocrisy. I think the debate around free speech, generally speaking, makes hypocrites of many of those engaged within it. I suppose you could say, to Farage's credit, he's trying to step outside of that a little bit and doing what is a relatively rare thing and saying, even though I abhor what that other person's saying, in the sort of classic cliche that people quote Voltaire, I'll defend to the death to the right to say. Yeah. So, but very, very often in these debates, and that's what I think has been deeply exposed on the MAGA right, certainly in the course of the last couple of weeks, it is very much people have a view which is free speech, as far as I'm concerned, is I'll say whatever the hell I like, but you can shut up. And that is very, very often, and I think, I don't think one political tribe or side has a kind of monopoly on that hypocrisy. I think what is telling is just at the point that the kind of right, who have felt that they have been oppressed in their views for a long time, who have cried cancellation and cried kind of freedom of speech restriction because they have felt that their views have been suppressed in whatever way, just at the point that they themselves are basically in the ascendancy and suddenly in control of that conversation more, then they're pulling on some of the sort of censorship free speech levers. But these things are a spectrum.
Yeah, and even a perfect example of it is that even as Jimmy Kimmel was still silenced, and we now know deep in conversation with Disney about what next steps would be, Donald Trump was on the stage at that memorial/rally for Charlie Kirk, criticising what the left was saying about free speech, defending free speech.
And this is when I say it's a spectrum, Sheila. I mean, look, I don't think, to be honest, that anyone should listen to Donald Trump too much about free speech. That's not to say that there aren't people around him, and perhaps indeed Kirk was in this category, that there aren't people around him and supporters of his who care very much about it. And I don't doubt that for a second. But let's be honest
Ted Cruz surprised everybody, didn't
Indeed.
he? Yeah.
And again, to Cruz's credit, not something that, necessarily is said that often, particularly in the last few years, but to Cruz's credit, he came out in that kind of Farage way and said that he's very concerned about the way that some of this conduct is going in terms of First Amendment and freedom of speech rights and so on. But let's be honest here, we're not... I mean, in a way, the Jimmy Kimmel thing is the kind of least of it. And when Farage says there that, Trump didn't have much to do with it, I mean, this is the point. He did have something to do with it, in the sense that it was the FCC chair, the FCC, which is basically their kind of version of Ofcom in a way, their kind of broadcasting regulatory authority. But their chair of that, Brendan Carr, publicly criticised Kimmel's remarks and suggested very explicitly that broadcasters and ABC affiliates could face regulatory consequences, i.e. potentially losing their broadcasting licenses
if they displease
if they allow. Now, that's not a restriction on free speech either. There's a good old-fashioned word for that, and that is censorship, or the threat of censorship, which is something which is illegal in the United States and which goes beyond to another level of chilling, disturbing political development.
And it's deeply anti-American.
It's deeply anti-American. It's deeply anti-democratic. It's not just sort of saying, no, this has gone too far in terms of the mores of what we find, or mores of what we find is acceptable. It's the direct consequence. Likewise with Donald Trump, again, the reason I say that we should treat any claim of his being a free speech champion a little gingerly is not least because what is Trump doing right now, and has not been doing so for some time since he's been president? He has been suing anybody that he doesn't like in the press or wherever it happens to be, literally for really giving him coverage he doesn't like. Look at the lawsuit that he's launched against the New York Times very recently. What is it, $15 billion lawsuit? I forget. Completely spurious, completely nonsense. But even in his own terms, what does he say the pretext is? Because he doesn't like the coverage that they've given him. Now, that is not a reason, even though plenty of politicians don't like the coverage that they get, that is no good reason to start launching lawsuits, particularly when you are the president of the United States. Because we've talked about this before. It's not just that, the New York Times will win that lawsuit, but it has a point. It has an effect. It sends a chill wind throughout all of the media and anyone who dares criticise him, and they just think, you know what? It ain't worth it. I'm not going to do it.
And can I bring all of this right back into the heart of the UK and the kind of conversations we have on air with our callers and our listeners? Many of them feel that they haven't been able to say what they think about certain issues. And we could both name topics where there has been a chilling effect on open discussion, where people have lost jobs for what they've said, perfectly rational things that have been said. How do we make sure that as we, I know the general election is ages away, but just in the course of our politics, it doesn't have to be about a general election, that in the course of our political discussion, we allow for the fullest free speech possible? Because people do try to chill it and do try to silence one another.
Look, I think this is a difficult one, Sheila, and it's a difficult one because, as I say, I think it comes from a sort of place of fundamental dishonesty half of the time, which is I think we have to decide, and this is a decision, maybe we sort of, we move from one position to the other, but basically, let's leave the censorship stuff and all of that thing to one side. That is clearly always unacceptable. The government or the state, by force of law, gagging people or shutting people up, right, unless they incite violence or do certain things which are beyond the pale, right? So let's leave that to one side. There is a tension. There is just a tension, which we should be more grown up about in our discussion, about a sort of competing clash of rights, if you like. What should the ability be of, say, let's take a university or a media organisation or whoever it happens to be. Let's say they decide to get rid of somebody or dismiss somebody or maybe not just re-employ somebody because they feel that something they've said or something they've written is beyond the acceptable kind of parameters of where politics is. And one can completely imagine that could be the case. I don't think anyone would demur if, for example, a university decided if they saw they had an academic who had written a blatantly racist piece or said something that was appallingly racist or appallingly misogynist or supporting violence, I don't think anyone would say, or few people would say, that university would not have the right to do that. But as soon as you've accepted that, as soon as you accept that free institutions in society... But aren't all those things
breaking the law?
Well, not being sexist isn't breaking the law, or being racist isn't breaking the law, unless you're inciting violence in that particular way. There's no law to say you can't be racist. This is the point. How do you deal as a society with the fact that there will be people who have some views which might be potentially beyond the parameters of where acceptable
incitement
politics
is different, isn't it?
Of course incitement is different, but what I'm saying is that there is sometimes a clash and a tension between the rights of an individual to hold certain views and the rights of a institution, a free organisation in a free society.
Not on my dollar. Yeah.
Exactly right. And where is the line between those two things? And I think the dishonesty of this is that most people would accept that there is some line, that there isn't just going to be carte blanche to say and do whatever you like when you work for someone or you work for an organisation or you write for somewhere and so on. You could have a world where we just had a kind of universal free speech where we just sort of say the only thing that matters is free speech and we can't criticise anyone, dismiss anyone or whatever it happens to be, or people lose their job because of something they say or feel. I think most people would accept that that is not a world that in reality is very practical or desirable. So once you accept that there is a line, then the whole discussion becomes about where that line is. And by definition, that's going to be contested and disagreed about.
And just a quick one before you go on what people say about one another. So, rather than just general racist terms or general sexist terms. Because in America, again, you can really push it, can't you, politically? You can hear politicians say things about each other in America that I just don't think would be tolerated here. Yeah. What's the key difference there? I mean, they have a kind of absolutist approach to it, don't they? You can say all kinds of things that we would regard as defamatory here.
I think American politics has always been a bit rougher. Just historically, it's always been a little bit rougher than British politics. I think British politics historically has had a slight sort of politesse.
That Mayflower left and everybody went,
they all went mad, all those Puritan lot. No, I think it's always had a slightly different tone and a different timbre to it. I think obviously also the Americans, and we've developed in this country more in recent years, the Americans have had since the late 1980s the rise of kind of, very, very opinionated cable news, a sort of polarisation of the media. That all social media's fed into that.
Podcasts.
And well, I mean, who'd listen to those, Sheila? Who'd listen to those?
Blimey.
But I do think, actually, just since you mentioned the defamation stuff, if we're talking about free speech, that's another way in which I think this debate often gets a bit sort of off the boil, which is that I think that there are some big problems with freedom of speech in this country, in the sense that very often rights of freedom of speech, or our legal system, basically is weighted towards the rich and powerful, because where we do have potential freedom of speech laws problems, which never gets talked about, is not so much about racism or inciting violence or whatever, where it's much more clear. It's about privacy and defamation. And how many stories I've worked on over the years, I'm sure you've been the same, Sheila, when suddenly you're writing to someone, you put in a right reply to someone who's very, very wealthy, very, very rich, and you get a legal letter on your doorstep, and you take it to your organisation, and you just think, oh, here we go, they're threatening defamation, because we have some of the strictest defamation and libel laws in this country, in the world. And for all of America's problems, they don't have that problem, because they have the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech.